I want to begin this morning by telling you a little bit more about myself. I love to cook. I am a cook at home. I enjoy making food. My wife goes and sometimes she travels for work trips. She's been in many different places all over the world, and it's really, really fun. And then I get left at home to my own devices. And there have been many times that when folks in the church or outside of the church find out that I'm at home by myself, they come up to me with a very concerned face. You know, many times it's actually the ladies that come up to me with a very concerned, they're like, Preston, your wife isn't there. You don't have any, are you going to be fed well? Like, do you have enough food? Are you going to be able to take care of yourself? Like, are you going to be okay? And my answer is yes, I'm the cook of the household. I'll be just fine. I'll be just fine. I love to make food. I love to cook food. That's just a joy that I have. It's my own, it's artistic expression. And for those of you that have been cooking food, and in particular, if you cooked ever and boiled together some pasta, I want to set the stage of perhaps a calamity that can happen when you are cooking pasta, where you get the water, you put it on the stove, you heat it up, it starts boiling, you put the noodles in there, whatever kind of noodles would be your preference, and then you sit there and maybe you get distracted, you look on your phone, there's some other thing going on in the house, and so you walk away from the stove. I don't know if you're supposed to do that or not, but we all do. You walk away from the stove and you're working on something, or you get distracted, and you turn around and you look, and noodles in boiling water do this thing with, I think, the starch that's on them, where the water and the boiling and the bubbles grows exponentially. And you see across the kitchen this boiling pot of bubbles about to boil over. And you get concerned, and you're oh no, and you move, and it's like slow motion going back to try to stop it, and you just, no matter how hard you try, it ends up boiling over. And you see that raising tension and then the boil over, and then you've got a mess on your hands. Maybe for some of you parents, maybe dads in particular, you've seen a similar expression with your own children, where you see far off your child is doing something, and they are doing something that is going to lead to a calamity. And you want to go and stop that, and you try, but you can't get there to stop it. You see the tension build up. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning, is in this passage, we're in a time where we see tension continuing to build. The noodle pot is boiling up, and no matter how quickly you may try to get back, it's going to boil over. It's going to boil over within this story, and that is in the story of Jesus Christ. And so, with your Bibles in hand or on phone, please open them to the book of Mark, chapter 12. We're going to be in verses 28 through 44 for our time this morning. And the last couple of passages, we have been in that place of seeing that boiling rising up, that tension rising. We've been seeing Jesus be at incredible odds with those that he is speaking to. He's been having issues with Pharisees. He's been cleaning out the temple. He's been talking to Herodians who have allegiance to Caesar and asking about taxes. He's been talking with the Sadducees. We just learned about the Sadducees last week. I won't make the Sadducees joke because those in At 9 have heard enough dad jokes for one day. If you weren't in At 9, you missed out on them. Maybe that's better for you, actually. I don't know. It depends on what you think about dad jokes. I won't make the joke here this morning, but there was the conflict with the Sadducees. Jesus is just making everybody upset. And I'm not one that enjoys conflict. And so I'm kind of seeing all these issues that are happening. Jesus is laying down this truth against these religious elites. And I'm getting nervous as I'm reading this passage, as we are in the midst of Holy Week, as we're still on Tuesday, by the way. We're still on Tuesday here. I'm like, Jesus, there's all there's these issues, there's these problems, and they're boiling up. What's it going to lead to? Well, those that know the gospel story knows where it boils over, right? We're seeing the bubbles coming up. This passage that we're going to be in is a collection of several different smaller storied accounts, different conversations Jesus had in the midst of Holy Tuesday. And though they are small, different accounts, they have different things and ways that they come together, but they are completely different stories. They're completely different stories in these rapid dialogues that happen as Jesus is at the temple talking with the religious elites and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and tension is rising. And we'll take some time on each of these four things because I think an important question to ask when we're looking at what Jesus is causing issues about is, why are they at odds in the first place? Why is Jesus at odds with the Jewish elites in the first place? It's a necessary question. There's a few ways we might have answered that as we continued through the story, but I think that this passage tells us about some very real differences between how Jesus regards the godly life, how he regards the scriptures, how he regards his mission, and how the Jewish elites regard the godly life or God or the scriptures. And when we see these differences in the way they flesh out, it's quite apparent that there was going to be a boiling over regardless. So each of these stories points us in that direction. We're going to go through each of these four stories in turn, starting at verse 28. And we're going to go till 34. I'm going to read this story in its entirety. We'll talk about it, then we'll kind of move chunk by chunk by chunk. It says this in verse 28, "And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he being Jesus, the scribe asked him, 'Which commandment is the most important of all?' Jesus answered, 'The most important is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.' And the scribe said to him, 'You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no one besides him. And to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices.' And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, 'You are not far from the kingdom of God.' And after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions." This passage continues on again these arguments and discussions that Jesus has been having on the Temple Mount as a part of Holy Tuesday. And he had just gotten done with an incredible owning of the Sadducees in a theological sense. And then after that, apparently there was a scribe that was listening. And we don't know anything about this dude, anything about this scribe. I imagine him kind of sitting in the back and listening and hearing all the things that this Jesus guy is talking about and the way that the religious people are talking with him. And he's got a question on his mind. And you wonder if it's a genuine one or not, but he decides to ask it. And he asks actually a very popular question of his time. Which of the commandments is the greatest? Which of the commandments of the Bible for them, the Torah, is the most important? Now, for some of us, we may ask that question due to our own personal laziness. Let me know just what I need to know to get on through. But I think there's also something else, a virtue in us asking this question. What is most important in God's eyes from me? What does God expect from me? That's a question I think we rarely ask in church. We love here in church talking about being saved by grace through faith, how it is not a result of our own works, so that no one may boast. And that is good, beautiful, the gospel, scriptural. That is our life foundation. But to end it there is to end any sense of what we might call a relationship with God. Our salvation, though it is completed by the belief in the gospel, the belief in his power to save you and me, there is still expectation that God has for us as his children. And to know that is crucial for you and for me. Jesus answers it. We start off, and he answers it faithfully, like a good, faithful Jew of his time, and even of today. Where he says, the most important is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. For those of you that remember the hand motions from Gather and Grow, and were thinking through the hand motions as you were singing that song, I was as well. But he recites a very popular, very crucial text in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. You're going to learn a little bit of Hebrew this morning, so I'm prepping you now. This passage is known as the Shema. Everybody say Shema. Shema is what it is. Shema is a word that means hear, listen up. When it says, Hear, O Israel, it's Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel. It's a very crucial, important prayer. The Jews at the time would practice this prayer, pardon the pun, religiously, where they would do so in the morning. They would wake up in the morning, and the first thing they did would recite this prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That was the first thing they did when they hopped out of bed. And then they would pray it throughout the day at different points. And in particular, they would make sure to pray it at the end of their day. It was the central commandment to the Jewish peoples of the day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all of your strength. And that's where it stopped. That's where it stopped. Jesus does something fascinating. He says, there's that prayer you know, that prayer you love, that prayer you practice, all this sort of stuff. But let's add something else to it. Let's add the logical conclusion to the beginning of this prayer, which is, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is the greatest commandment. He said, there is no other commandment, notice in the singular, verse 31, no other commandment greater than these. These are two different passages. The Shema is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. The love your neighbors yourself is found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18. Two different commandments, but he calls them one. Two different commandments, calls them one. There's a fascinating quote from people who study different expressions of religion around the world. And they say the most important thing to know when you want to know about a religion is what's the second most important commandment. Because by definition, religion is worshiping God, a god or gods or whatever that may be. And Judaism and Christianity is no different. You worship God, that is the most important. But that second most important is how different religious beliefs can change. For the Jews at the time, the second most important religious belief, aside from believing in the Lord and giving him all that you have, was and practice the sacrifices. Make sure you are faithful with your sacrifices. Make sure you are faithful with these offerings you're supposed to give. That was number 2. And then after that, for the Jewish sources, number 3 was, and then you love others. Jesus cuts out the sacrifices altogether and says, no. That is not necessary. That is not the greatest commandment. You love God and you love others. That is the greatest commandment. That's a bold statement to say on the Temple Mount, isn't it? You can still smell the fumes from the burnt offerings as Jesus is saying this. All these sacrifices that you guys think are so important are not necessary. It is love the Lord your God with all that you have. And because of that, you can love your neighbor as yourself. When we look at this passage, this is a complete whole passage that focuses our affections entirely on God and then entirely on others. We are to give him all things that we have. There's no space in the alls, the all of your heart, all of your mind, all of your soul, all of your strength. There is no space there. And we try to decipher, what does it mean to have all of these things in different ways? How do I love God with all of my mind, with all of my soul, with all of my... How do we do these things? The point is fullness. What is God's expectation of us? God desires the fullness of us. There's not a part of ourselves we can hide from God. There's not a part of ourselves that we must remain unchanged by God. God affects all of us. And we are to take that and use that all for others. Love God, love others. And so you see the way that the Jews of the day and that Jesus think of it differently. And you see that continues to see the bubbles coming up. But no, Jesus isn't done here. Jesus continues on. This seems to take a bit of a pause for any conversations that were happening at that time, a bit of an awkward silence in the crowd. And so then Jesus decides to invite another in-depth conversation. Verses 35 through 37 say this. And as Jesus taught in the temple, he said this, "How can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself in the Holy Scripture declared, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' David himself calls him Lord, so how is he his son?" And the great throng, the great crowd, heard him gladly. Finished one story, one segment. We stop, we jump into this next story, this next segment. Jesus is introducing a new conversation here entirely. And for this, we again need to continue to know a little bit of what the thinking was at the time, especially about David. You all know David. Maybe you don't know him personally. Maybe you haven't heard of him. Maybe you haven't met him before. But many of us have heard of David from the Old Testament. He was the second king of Israel. Almost got that one wrong. Second king of Israel. He was formerly a shepherd. David and Goliath. David and Bathsheba. All these sorts of things. We know David. We love David. We appreciate David. We see his flaws. But we see that at the end of the day, he was a man after God's own heart. The people at this time revered David incredibly. They connected David with the Messiah, and they said that the Messiah would be a descendant of David. Going along with the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel, he's going to be the son of David. But Jesus raises an interesting point here. He asks a very hard question. How can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? How can this Messiah, this world Savior, be less than David? When it says son, it doesn't just mean, just his literal son. It means to some degree less than. The Jews at the time put David at the peak. There was nothing that could do better than David. Nothing that could do better than David in their eyes. And Jesus challenges this. How is that possible? Especially since David referred to him not just as, a Messiah, but as his Lord, as his God, as his master. David viewed this Messiah, and he quotes from Psalm 110. Psalm 110, verses 1 and 2. And he says, how can this Messiah, be less than if David calls him master? This Messiah that would come, that is expecting all things from his people, is Lord of all things, even Lord of the greatest thing that we can think of, that in the time being David. And he quotes the scriptures to communicate. Another isolated incident. What do we do with this incident? I think what we do with this incident is we get and we recognize that just as Jesus is greater than David, God's plan on this earth is greater than what he had already done. I think many times we run into a temptation of looking backwards a lot and saying things were a lot better, insert the time. Things were a lot better. Insert the space, insert the location, insert the year, whatever that looks like. Times could be better. The Jews at the time did that. They said things were amazing when David was king. It was awesome. We were independent. We didn't have oppressors over us. We were a nation faithful to God. Kind of sounds like some vocabulary that I've heard Christians use, right? That was the best it could be. Really? Is that the best it could be? The best it could be for David, the extent of David's kingdom was an earthly independence from oppressors and an earthly faithfulness from imperfect people with a perfect God. But if Jesus is greater than David, which he is, the Messiah is greater than David than he is, then God's in the business of completely exceeding our expectations of him. In youth group, we went through the book of Revelation. Students, you may have heard me say this a couple of times, but when you talk about Revelation and the beauty and the power and the hope of what God's final plan is for the world, you can never imagine it to be too great for God's plan. We can never outperform God in how good things are going to be with him as king. We never have to pull back our desires because we will never reach the fullest extent of how amazing God's kingdom is, both now and in the age to come. I think the question is this: do we dream big enough for God? What do we desire from God? What do we desire from God as king? What is that desire in your heart? God is king, so he's going to give me this. God is king, so he's going to give me that. God's a lot bigger than this or that, whatever that may be. Whether it's earthly autonomy, whether it's some sort of faithful place in this sinful world, whether it's security in my own life or in the life of people I love, whether it's peace from issues that I see around me. It may be that, but it's going to be something greater. Why? Because the Messiah is Lord of all things. Very different understanding than the Jews had. This Messiah wasn't going to be greater than David, so they said. The bubbles continue to rise. We continue on. Verse 38 through 40. Separate story into a new story. Verse 38 through 40. The bubbles are rising. Let's see if Jesus helps to calm it down a little bit. And in his teaching, he said, "Beware of the scribes." Not getting really calm here, are we? Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus has been speaking of what this new kingdom would be. It'd be greater than we can imagine, and it's a kingdom focused on wholehearted love to God and wholehearted love towards others. Jesus at this point puts in a radical contrast with the scribes, where he says, God is going to bring in something amazing. What you guys see as these righteous people, they are nothing. They are nothing compared to how great God's kingdom will be. Beware of the scribes. They may look righteous. They may have long robes. They may seem to have it all together, but they are selfish. They are self-gratifying. They are oppressive in their own ways, put incredible taxes to impact the vulnerable. In this passage, it's the widows. An incredible warning. The Old Testament spoke horribly of people who devoured the vulnerable. The four vulnerable in the Old Testament were the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, and the poor. That's what God's judgment was on Israel. And that's what his judgment is here on the scribes. The water continues to boil. And so we move on. We finish out verse 41 through 44 with a very famous story. It's one of my favorite stories. It says this, as he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box, many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him, and he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more money than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." First, recognize the irony of him just critiquing the scribes for devouring widows' households, and then we see a widow giving to the temple all that she has. First, notice that irony. She may not necessarily be doing it for the scribes. She's doing it for God and saying, "It's in your hands, God. I just know what I'm supposed to do, and that's my job. You take care of the rest." But what we also see here is a very whole example of what Jesus had been talking about in the beginning of this passage, the greatest command. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love him wholly, love him fully. And then love your neighbor as yourself. We don't know this widow's story. We know she at least lost a husband. We don't know of children. We don't know of support. We don't know of a home place. We don't know if she had a home. We don't know if she knew what she was cooking for dinner that night. We don't know any of these things. All we know is the action she took to show how serious she was of loving God with everything she has. And it can seem so minuscule. It can seem so pointless. I think there's parts of us that look at this and says 2 small copper coins. I made a mistake in my notes. It's going to say 2 pennies. It says 2 copper coins that make a penny. Not even 2. I heard it said that if you're walking along the streets and you look down and you find a penny, you are going to lose money with the time you spend to reach down and pick up that penny. It may seem pointless. What can a penny do? What can a penny do for God's kingdom? It's a fair question, but I ask, what can any of us do for God's kingdom? What can you or I do for God's kingdom? Is God the one not in control? Could God be the one that decides he's the one that's going to work? Oh, and he does. He does the work in and through us. Does he need us? No. Does he need your talents or your giftings or my talents or my giftings? No. We put value on some of the things we can do. And some of us can compare ourselves to others depending on stages of life, depending on struggles in life, depending on what you have, what you can do, and say, I can do nothing like that. Well, how is God going to use me? I want to serve him, but I don't have anything for insert reason here. This widow gave all things. God doesn't need our stuff. He needs our hearts. God's going to do whatever he's going to do without our stuff or with it. He doesn't need it. His priority is your heart and mine. It's already going to happen. He is in control after all. He is going to win after all. When we say this, I want to think specifically, and this is a moment that I want to take, especially I've been noticing just as I look through directory or whatever, I think of even many folks in our church who are shut-ins. And I don't think they really get talked about a whole lot. I think many times it can be easy to forget. And that can cause all of us, I noticed the squeaming in the room as I said that. Or maybe if they're listening right now, or there's folks that may struggle with mobility that are listening right now, that may have struggled with this question in a far greater way than I have. And I don't know that struggle, but what I do know here is that what is more important? A faithful shut-in praying for God to work in this world and in their church, or somebody that can go out and move mountains? What's more important in God's eyes? The answer, I don't think, is as simple as that. But I think that the answer focuses less on what is actually done and focused on more of where's the heart at. Where's your heart at? What are your 2 pennies, or what is your penny, I guess, that you can give in the small things, in the little things? Parents faithfully raising children day in and day out through the ups and downs. May not seem like a small thing. Some of the small things that are actually big things. The point here is the heart. All of our heart, giving all that we have, whatever that may be, to God. To be God's child is to give everything to God. To be God's child is to give everything we have to God. We all sit back and we say, we may all have a lot, we may have a little. But as we saw at the beginning of this passage, the focus is on what is most important. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And love your neighbor as yourself, in whatever capacity that is. And wherever God has you in this season, and wherever God has you in this life, give everything to God. The basics of the Christian life are this: God has given everything to us for His glory and for our benefit. We in turn are to give everything we have back to Him in faith of what He says He will do. God's the one that's going to make it happen. He knows that. We need to remember that. What are we to do? To give all that we can back to God, knowing that He will be faithful to His promises. That is our job. Go and do likewise.